So let's say you get a new lead in your CRM and you want this agent to automatically be able to reach out to that lead, but reference information about your business. It has the ability to take sales materials, information about your products and services, how you handle the sales process, and essentially implement that into how it generates emails and coming soon, SMS, WhatsApp messages out to this lead, can manage the conversation with the lead with the intent of trying to book a meeting with a human sales rep. So it's going to kind of take that angle and try to answer all your questions, but give you a call to action so that you can book a meeting and it gets handed off to the sales team. And now all of a sudden you have a warm lead that was automatically warmed up through the process with an agent, as opposed to having to rely on an SDR to do those activities, right?
This podcast is brought to you by Fast Slow Motion, a team of expert consultants that have helped thousands of growing businesses build scalable systems on the Salesforce and HubSpot platforms. To learn more, visit fastslowmotion.com. Welcome to the Fast Slow Motion podcast, where we teach you how to build a business you love while enjoying your life. I'm your host, Sam Donaghey, and on today's episode, we're diving into Salesforce's Spring 25 release. And I'm really excited to have Zack Terry, Fast Slow Motion's Director of AI, here with me. Zack, it's good to see you again. Welcome to the show.
Sam, great to be here. Thanks for having me back.
100%. Well, Zack, let's start off with Agentforce. Salesforce has rebranded Einstein Copilot to Agentforce. So let me ask you, what's driving this change and what's the vision for its future?
First, I would say it's much more than a rebrand. So Agentforce is a massive expansion of what was Copilot. So Copilot was essentially just for internal use. Now agents are available for external use. They can do a whole lot more in terms of the capabilities and the ability to essentially understand what somebody is asking it and go and retrieve actions to handle certain things autonomously. So it's a big expansion to what Copilot was, which I think is a really great example of Salesforce listening to the market and determining that they needed to build something that was a lot more useful. And so they've done that with Agentforce. They've created something that's a lot more useful and can be applied to a lot more businesses and not just for internal use. So a big opportunity to save time for a lot of different manual processes for different lines of business and employees within that business, right? Mark said that all the wood is behind the Agentforce arrow, which if you've seen the marketing from Salesforce, they are all in on Agentforce. And Matthew McConaughey is in on it too, and he's very excited. So I think we're going to expect to see a lot of innovation and new features leveraging Agentforce and generative AI. I think we're just scratching the surface. We've only got a few pre-built agents available today, but there's a lot of innovation coming and different products that Salesforce is talking about releasing here over the next year or so. So I expect this to really grow at the pace it's already been growing. Hard to believe we only started talking about this 2 years ago, and Agentforce was just released in October. So it feels like an eternity ago that this happened because of the pace of this innovation. So yeah, it's really, really quite impressive to see all the growth in this space.
Yeah, it's been such a big shift. And so a question for you would be, what kind of businesses do you think might benefit from this most right away?
That's a tough question to answer because I think it entirely depends on what you do as a business and how well you understand your business process. I think the biggest mistake you could make is just to go and buy AI, but not have a use case for it. You really need to define your use cases. So any business that has inefficiencies, which is most businesses, right? I think all businesses have some form of inefficiency. If we can identify the bottlenecks and determine where can an agent handle this. And right now that's within a conversational interface, but the ability to invoke agents with what's called essentially a headless agent, where we have an agent API in Salesforce. I'm speaking specifically about Agentforce and not about the many other agent tools that are available on the market. But for now, it's, hey, how can a conversational interface help? In the future, we'll be able to essentially invoke agents without having to type into a chat window and take that information and have it perform tasks on our behalf and return that information, right? So I think it's going to expand to a lot more use cases as we have the ability to deploy it in different ways beyond just the traditional chat interface. The most immediate use cases are service, right? Service agents, and I'll say human beings, employees that are doing service work. There's probably a large amount of that work that is relatively low value. So answering simple questions, stuff you have on a knowledge base is already there. If the customer had the ability to go and find it, they could probably find the answer to their question. But instead, they're sending you an email, they're giving you a phone call, and you're having to answer those questions. Having an agent do that instead, have access to that information without having to flip through it as a person, right? Go through and look at our knowledge base and try to figure out what the answer is, or at least have it memorized off the top of our heads, gives us the opportunity to then work on more high value information. So more complex cases, cases that require human intervention, cases that require special consideration. So service is, of course, a big example.
Yeah.
There's a cool feature that Salesforce has released called an SDR agent, which allows the agent to reach out to leads automatically. So let's say you get a new lead in your CRM and you want this agent to automatically be able to reach out to that lead, but reference information about your business. It has the ability to take sales materials, information about your products and services, how you handle the sales process, and essentially implement that into how it generates emails and, coming soon, SMS, WhatsApp messages out to this lead, can manage the conversation with the lead with the intent of trying to book a meeting with a human sales rep. So it's going to kind of take that angle and try to answer all your questions, but give you a call to action so that you can book a meeting and it gets handed off to the sales team. And now all of a sudden you have a warm lead that was automatically warmed up through the process with an agent, as opposed to having to rely on an SDR to do those activities, right? Which is really interesting. And again, I think the same sort of argument there is, we're not trying to replace SDRs with agents. We're trying to allow SDRs to focus on the most valuable work, the work that requires complexity, and then let the agents handle the simpler tasks. That way it's saving them time. They're focusing on more high value information. So I think it's really interesting. But the question around which businesses are going to be the most ripe to use agents, I think, is not dependent on your industry. It's more dependent on how well you understand the business and where you can identify how to plug an agent into your workflow to generate the highest value.
Great insights. Zack, Agentforce now also supports multiple languages. So what should we know about this?
Salesforce is worldwide. So it only makes sense that there would be additional language support. There's a lot of businesses that are not based in the United States or in English-speaking countries. And so this is a great expansion for customers that are not in English-speaking countries or work with customers and clients that are outside of English-speaking countries to be able to expand that into French, German, Italian, Portuguese. I believe Japanese is coming in the near future. So right now it's a collection of just a few additional languages, but over time, I think this will only continue to expand because Salesforce, of course, is everywhere. They have customers and clients everywhere. Naturally, they're going to continue to support an expansion of language on agents and other tools as they have on the existing Salesforce platform already.
Yeah, this is a game changer for global businesses for sure. Do you think AI translation accuracy is the point where businesses can sort of fully rely on it?
Well, I'll give the disclaimer. You almost always want to have a human in the loop with anything involved with generative AI, just because of the risk of hallucinations. Now, that's come a long way in the 2 years it's been since this sort of hit the zeitgeist. But it's never a good idea to solely rely on an agent because it can make mistakes. You need some quality assurance there, right? Translation is a pretty well-established market. There's a lot of tools that did this before generative AI, and they did a really good job. So I don't have a lot of hesitation around the ability to do this. If we think about what generative AI does, it's just taking an utterance from a user and turning it into numbers and comparing it to all of the data that it has, which is also in a bunch of numbers, and just figuring out the next most likely response to generate an answer. And so if that's in English or another language, as long as we're training it on those languages, I would expect it to produce similar results to English. Now, I think generally, most of the data we've trained it on has been English. because most of the big players in AI today are based in the United States. But this is rapidly expanding. I mean, we just saw DeepSeek coming out of China releasing their own model. And so I do think this is going to continue to essentially just get better and better. But like I said, you always want a human in the loop. You want someone to check and make sure the translations are accurate. I would never rely on the response of an agent 100% without having some kind of quality assurance.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about how Agentforce now lets admins create multiple agent versions. And they also offer Agentforce for setup feature.
I can speak to this firsthand. We've just completed a couple of Agentforce projects. And currently, before this release, there's no versioning in Agentforce. So imagine that I create a service agent and I'm adding topics for this agent, and I'm adding a bunch of instructions for how this agent is supposed to handle the information, how it's going to retrieve the information and return that back to the user. As you can imagine, through the testing process, little changes to your wording or where you place that wording can have a big impact on how that agent actually responds. So there's a lot of drafting and back and forth that happens when you're creating an agent and making sure that it's going to respond in the way that you expect. Well, before this release, there's no versioning. So if I change something in a topic, I change the instructions, I had better document what I changed because I can't revert back to it. With versioning, now we'll be able to create a version of an agent, activate that agent, then come back and say, I want to make some changes. Let's go make some changes for version 2. Well, what happens if version 2 performs in a way that is completely unexpected and we need to revert that back to version 1? Before this update, I would have had to have my version 1 documented somewhere else, go grab the language and then replace it in the agent so that it's now referencing the older version of that information. Now with versioning, we'll be able to just say, okay, I just want to revert it back to version 1. So you can almost think about it like flow versions today. We have the ability to create a flow, activate that flow, come back, create a new version of the flow, make changes to it, activate the new version, but we still have access to the old version if we need to revert back. So it's a really big quality of life improvement to not have to manually track those changes, but instead just have that native support.
Okay, Agentforce for setup is being called a sidekick for admin tasks. So how does this tool help Salesforce admins troubleshoot and manage their work more efficiently?
A few releases ago, we did a podcast talking about setup being modernized and adding the ability to audit user permissions more easily by viewing summaries of their permissions. I think I mentioned offhand that at TDX last year, product managers at Salesforce talked about how awesome it would be to bring Agentforce into setup to where you could ask the agent questions about common setup items, including user permissions, and it could go and reference your system and pull back that information. Well, this is that feature. So the idea behind this is sort of like a virtual admin assistant. It should help with common admin tasks, the ability to create report types, search through Salesforce help documentation to give you answers where maybe you would go to Google or maybe you had another window open with Perplexity or ChatGPT. Well, now you'll have the ability to search through Salesforce documentation directly within inside of this agent for setup. So I think it's a pretty exciting update that a lot of admins will really like, because instead of having to search through all the menus inside of the back end of setup, you can just ask the agent a question. Now, I'll say it's not live yet, so I haven't had a chance to use it, and I don't know if there are limitations to what types of questions or what types of information it can access within setup, but just the concept of having something to help an admin do admin tasks is very exciting. And even if it's limited at first, I think we can expect this to grow in features and functions over time.
So what about, the new tools or features that Agentforce offers for service teams? How can they make, things easier for both the team and the customers?
Service agent is the one that immediately comes to mind. So you have an autonomous agent that can help with your customer service issues. And that's what we talked about earlier. You can reference knowledge articles. You can take unstructured data like PDF files that might have information about your business or how you should answer questions, upload that to the system, and then the agent can reference that information and easily respond to it. But it can also do things like manage cases, create new cases, update cases, manage accounts, do things with order management, return information about your orders as a customer. So there's a lot of really good possibilities with the service agent. We've seen a lot of these use cases already. That the agent's been around since October. And so this is, I think, the easiest use case to understand, right? It can help people with the help that they need, which is fantastic. So having that is a great service feature. Beyond the agent capabilities, there are Einstein service replies and reply recommendations. So imagine you are, as a human being, handling a conversation with a customer. Well, service replies and reply recommendations can essentially look at the conversation that you are having and intelligently recommend knowledge articles that might answer the question in the conversation you're having with the customer, which is really cool because it makes you look really smart really fast, right? If I'm sitting here talking with you and you ask me a question and I know it's somewhere, but I don't know where it is, and I'd have to go and look through our internal wiki to find it. Well, imagine just an agent saw the conversation and can surface that for you without you having to spend time to search for it, but you're still able to respond to the customer inside that chat. Really cool.
And that's doing that in real time as the conversation's unfolding?
It is, yeah. So it's basically looking at that conversation and giving you the recommendations based on the content of that conversation. So if it lines up to something you have in your knowledge base, it's able to surface that for you so that you can provide it to the customer. Or maybe you don't want to provide them the article, but you want quick access to the article so that you can see the information. Maybe you don't have that memorized or have it offhand. That gives you the ability to answer that question without having to go and manually search for it.
What technology is actually driving that then? Is that transcription? Is that word form, or is that actually listening to...
Yeah, so as of today, it would have just been transcription, or I'm physically chatting with somebody. And so I have a transcription of the chat already because it's in Word format, right? Coming in the next release will be support for voice. So Einstein Conversation Insights, which is a different product than service replies and reply recommendations. But Conversation Insights will support voice. So it'll be able to analyze the information without having to rely on a transcript. Previously, you did have to have a transcript. You'd have to upload that data or supply that transcript. Now it will be able to take that information directly from the voice recording or the voice content in a video recording. So like we've been talking about, just continuous improvements, more features coming to enable more seamless interactions with AI, and whether that's generative AI or things like case classification, which can analyze your case data in the background and automatically determine the type of case it should be, or it could summarize some of the key points of that case. Lots of features like that. Some are generative AI, some are just predictive AI, but a lot of really cool features useful for service.
Zach, let's move on to Einstein. So what updates in Einstein are going to be most exciting for teams looking to improve productivity and uncover actionable insights?
We just talked about Einstein Conversation Insights, conversation mining supporting voice. So that's very exciting. It's also going to support additional languages, just like agents are going to. Einstein bots will now have a conversion tool to turn a bot into an agent. So think about the retirement of process builder and workflow rules. Salesforce created a migrate to flow tool. This is similar. I don't expect bots are going to be retired, but if you have an existing chatbot and you're looking to implement generative AI, this is a really good opportunity to make that process more seamless. So we don't know a whole lot of details about it yet, but just the idea that we'll have a tool to help us convert our existing deterministic bots to a non-deterministic agent.
So you don't have to build it from scratch.
Exactly. And I would think about it similar to the migrate to flow tool. I wouldn't just rely on it to automatically do it perfectly. It's still going to require a human to look at it and make sure that things are configured correctly, but it's a really good starting point. I think it's going to make it a lot easier to do that.
Hey, Zach, how does adding voice support and more languages to Einstein conversation mining make it more useful for teams?
Imagine you have a recording of a customer call or a sales call. Instead of having to generate a transcript and upload it or rely on chat conversations, email to case, web to case, essentially text. So instead of having to rely on that text being in the system, imagine Einstein can just take that voice recording itself and mine it for conversational insights without having to have a transcript. So that is a much more seamless experience. You can essentially just give Einstein access to your recordings, and then it can listen in or take that recording and find insights, sentiment analysis, recommend next steps if you're on a deal, things like that. So I think it's really cool. It's definitely just having the ability to analyze a conversation. It takes another step out of the process, makes it easier to get the insight without having to rely on something like a transcript. Similarly, having additional language support, just like we said before, Salesforce is a global company. So the more language support we can get, the better it is for their customers.
Zach, I know this is a topic that you love to talk about. Flow, it's an essential tool in Salesforce. What standout features in this release are helping teams streamline their processes?
No surprise, there are a lot of cool Flow updates coming yet again, showing the continued investment in Flow as more or less the preferred automation tool for declarative automation. One of the most exciting features is called Reactive Screens. That name is a little bit confusing because Flow has a feature called Reactivity, which is similar. The naming for reactive screens sort of belies its power and capabilities. A few, maybe one or two podcasts ago, we talked about the action button. So the action button was the ability for us to, on a screen flow, place a button on the screen. The user can press that button. And then while you're still on the same screen, it can launch an automation in the background and go and, let's say, retrieve some information to then populate back on that screen. Well, this is the next iteration of that. Now you don't even have to have the button. So you can essentially call an action on that same screen, reacting to what's being put into the screen. So I can just start entering information into that screen. We put some logic into the flow to say, well, when this is filled out, go and launch this other auto launch flow and then return this information, and it automatically would populate that information on the screen. So it's fewer steps for the user. It's a better user experience because they don't have to actually take action and press a button. It is in real time reacting to what is being input on that screen, which from a business process perspective has a lot of advantages. It's faster, so it's a better user experience for the customer or the user. Maybe it's an internal employee, maybe it's somebody on an experience site that's entering this information, and they're able to return that without having to take additional action. So that I think is the most exciting feature. Some other features that are great, there's now a native progress bar for ScreenFlow. So if you think about an opportunity or a lead in Salesforce, there's the path across the top. So you've got the opportunity stages. That is now essentially coming to ScreenFlow. So it's sort of like custom paths, but it's progress bars inside of your ScreenFlow. Before, you would have had to have a custom component. There's a lot of third-party components that can do this. You can create your own if you want to, but now it's a native ScreenFlow component. So you can create a custom progress bar that will show that path and the progress you're making as you go through that flow directly inside of just native Salesforce flow capabilities. So I love that. I'm excited about that. Transform continues to be supported and features continue to be added. So now the transform element, which as a reminder, that is the element that can take information from a collection and then use some data mapping to transform it into something else. So let's say that I had orders from Salesforce, and then I also had orders from a third-party system. And I wanted to take those two different sources of orders and I wanted to combine it into a single collection. Before this release, you couldn't do that. It did not support collection to collection capabilities. But now I can transform two different collections or multiple collections into a single collection. And so it's from an impact perspective, it's just expanding the capabilities much further. And transform is more efficient than the previous method used to do this, which would have involved looping through that collection, assigning the values to a new collection, and doing that for every single thing inside of it, right?
So it sounds like a massive efficiency boost.
It is, yeah. And from a system performance perspective, it's a massive efficiency boost. So this transform element is more efficient than using the older method to loop through that collection and create a new collection. So the fact that we can now take multiple collections and turn it into another collection is just another really great enhancement for that element.
So what about attachments in send email action?
The send email action is getting more updates, which is exciting to see. Every release for maybe the past 2 or 3 releases has brought some more iterative updates here. So now we're seeing the ability to add attachments to that action, which is great. So beforehand, you would have had to put that in a URL and store that on either, maybe it's inside of Salesforce, maybe you store it on Google Drive or Dropbox or something. Well, now you can just attach a file directly inside of that email when it's sent from Flow.
Zack, Einstein generative AI for flow descriptions. Tell us more about this.
With the last release, we saw the ability for generating flows by using natural language. That capability is still there, but now this will bring the ability to analyze an existing flow and spit out a description about what that flow does. So for, let's say, a new admin at an existing org, and you're trying to get familiar with what's going on, if that org doesn't have really good descriptions, it can be pretty hard to figure out what's happening, especially if you have a lot of flows in the organization. So the way that I imagine this is I can go in, take a flow, ask Einstein to generate a description of that flow, and it will analyze what the flow does from a system perspective. Look at the elements in the flow, look at anything it's retrieving, updating, creating, and spit out a description in plain language to make it easy to understand. So really exciting if you're a new admin or you're inheriting an existing org, or you just have a flow where you're not quite sure what it does and it would take a lot of time to analyze it on your own. Just having the ability to generate that description is powerful. Same disclaimer I would give you before, though. Generative AI can make mistakes, so I wouldn't trust it to be 100% accurate every time. So always do some due diligence to check the response and make sure that it is in fact accurate and telling you what it is going to be doing.
That makes a lot of sense. Zack, are there any other changes that you want to cover with Flow?
There's a lot of small changes. So they're redesigning the splash screen for new flows. They've redesigned this a few times, and now it's just another iteration of that design when you go to create a new flow, just how the options are presented. There's the ability to monitor flows directly from the automation app, which is that app at the front end that allows you to view flows. You can now monitor information directly from there. And what I think is the most exciting of the small updates is the ability to see flow version history from within the flow builder itself, which is, it seems like a really small update, but if you work in flow all day, every day, if you had multiple versions of a flow, you'd have to hit the back button, go identify where the flow is in the list view, click on something else to go and find the details of the flow, and then view all the versions from there. So just to have the ability to do that directly inside of Flow Builder is a big time saver over time, because you can imagine having to do that multiple times a day. It can take a long time, but now it's there. It makes it a lot easier to identify which versions you have and information about those versions.
Very good. Zack, you also mentioned Transform. So what makes the new Transform element in Flow such an important update?
Transform has been around for a few releases, but now it's more powerful than ever before. It allows us to transform multiple sources into a single collection. So I use the example of order data, but having order data from multiple systems, generating two different collections and having the ability to join that into a single collection just makes it a lot easier to deal with those multiple collections instead of having to do multiple loops. And then before, the previous iterations of Transform did not support taking multiple collections and turning it into a single collection. So it's just a nice update to make things a little bit more powerful, a little bit more easy to use.
Hey, Zack, what new platform features are we going to see in this next release?
There's a few cool platform features coming. If you've worked with quick actions before, let's say you're creating a custom quick action on your opportunity. Maybe it's a Mark 1 a quick action so that you can easily surface the fields you need to close that opportunity and mark it as 1. What if you wanted to have a custom message after you mark that as 1? So congratulations, you closed the opportunity, right? Or imagine you're on the account and you want to mark the opportunity as close 1 from there, or whatever that might be, right? If you wanted to put a custom message in that quick action, it would not provide a link to the record. Now you have the ability to provide a link to the record even with a custom message. So it just makes it a lot easier to navigate. Beforehand, it was just a plain language, new record created or record updated. So if you wanted to provide custom language, you had to essentially trade off the ability to have the ability to click directly into the record. Well, now you can do that with custom language. Something that's been on the Idea Exchange for, I want to say, a decade. I'm not sure if it's exactly a decade, but it's been there for a long time, is the ability to use multi-column sorting with your list views.
Okay.
So before this release, for a very long time, you can only select one parameter to sort that list view by. And you're probably familiar with that by clicking the column and then it sorts by that column. Now you can sort by multiple columns. So you can say, well, first sort by the close date of the opportunity and then sort by the account name or whatever sort of combination you want to come up with. but it makes it a lot easier to work with that data in a list view because now you have the ability to sort it in multiple ways. Coming to dashboards, you will now have the ability to refresh individual dashboard widgets instead of the entire dashboard itself. And so if you're looking at a specific component on that dashboard and you know it's out of date, instead of having to refresh the entire dashboard and wait for all that data to populate, you can just refresh that component. Small update, nice little quality of life sort of enhancement, and that is also releasing in beta. So it'll be available, but it's not technically generally available yet. So if there are any issues with that, it could just be a part of that beta release. And then an update that I think is, again, it seems really small, but it's exciting, is an increased limit on custom fields for activities. So for as long as I can remember, you could only put 100 custom fields on the activity object, which sounds like a lot, but the activity object represents both tasks and events. So if you had a lot of customization you needed to do to your tasks and to your events, you might hit that limit pretty quickly. Well, now it's going to be up to 300 custom fields. So they're tripling the capacity for custom fields on the activity object, which is a really big update.
You've actually got me very excited about that multi-column sorting coming, by the way. So thank you.
Hey, everyone. Going to be
Zach, Salesforce has introduced updates to Sales Cloud. So could you run us through some of those?
Quick name change. So collaborative forecasting is no longer called collaborative forecasting. It's called pipeline forecasting.
Gotta love a name change.
I really do like this one because it makes more sense. You're forecasting your pipeline. Collaborative made it a little bit unclear what exactly you were forecasting, but now you know exactly what it is. It's your pipeline, it's your opportunities, you're forecasting revenue into the future, which is great. Speaking of forecasting, it will now support consumption-based businesses. This has always been a challenge to track, especially with forecasting, because it didn't have the ability to track that consumption. But now it has a bunch of customization that you can add to help businesses that do rely on a consumption-based model to predict revenue based on how much a customer is using a product or service. So we'll see a lot of additional enhancements to that to make that a lot easier for companies to track. The account plan feature now has a new record research component. So the account plan feature came out in the last release. It essentially allows you to define goals for your accounts, SWOT analysis. You can track news and information like that just in fields, but it wasn't doing anything to bring in real-time updates about what was going on. The record research component is going to use generative AI to research external companies, but directly from within Salesforce. And so it'll be able to pull that information into Salesforce without you having to go and do that research yourself, which I think is a really great update. And then also of note is that is not going to be immediately available with the Spring 25 release. That is on a delayed release, and the current timeline is expected to come in April. A couple other things. The sales action plans feature now supports the ability to assign specific tasks and events to sales team members. So that just helps ensure accountability through the sales process, makes it easier to track next steps. What do I do at this point in the deal? Okay, I have a task based on the sales plan that we've come up with, which is just a nice enhancement. And then those can, of course, be linked to accounts, contacts, opportunities, any kind of record in Salesforce where you're needing to track that plan. You can now add those tasks to those plans. And then finally, and I'll gloss over this, but this may be worth discussing in more detail, but Agentforce has a sales coach agent now, which is pretty cool because it allows you to role play your sales motion and how you negotiate, how you talk about the deal. And AI will analyze your pitch, your negotiation, your information about that deal, your knowledge about the opportunity and the customer, and it will give you recommendations on what are you doing well, what did you miss, where could you improve, how could you change the inflection of your voice based on what you're doing here. So it's a cool feature, I think, for businesses that onboard a lot of salespeople and at a scale where it's difficult to onboard people. This can be used because it's trained on your data. It can be used to help coach new sales reps on how they can best represent the company and how they can best address objections and information coming from the prospect.
So finally, Zach, let's look at Service Cloud. What are some of the key updates for customer service teams in this release?
We've got a new Service Insights feature. that uses Tableau to analyze trends in your service department. So case trends, agent activity, customer satisfaction can help identify that information and surface that in a nice analytics report so that you can view it and figure out what trends you need to be aware of in order to make decisions with your service department. There's a new Lightning editor for knowledge articles. So just a more modern editor for knowledge to make it easier for you to create those knowledge articles, write those knowledge articles. And speaking of knowledge articles, there's also a new Einstein generative AI feature to help you draft and revise knowledge articles. So just like we have this for emails, where I can generate a sales email using Gen AI, now if I am responsible for creating the knowledge articles for my company, I can now also leverage generative AI to help me draft those articles, proofread it, adjust my grammar, make it more readable, more concise, things like that. So that's a great update coming for anyone that's working with knowledge articles and has to write those inside of Salesforce. Entitlements and milestones can now be automated in Flow. That also includes milestone completion. So that's a nice update. Beforehand, a lot of that would require custom code or Apex to do that. So now that it's accessible within Flow, it just makes it easier for admins and people working within your Service Cloud instance to create automations based on entitlements and milestones. There's a new routing button that is coming to cases that makes it easy to reassign those cases, even if you want to reassign those cases to an agent, which is really cool. Supervisors now can also chat with Agentforce. So maybe they need to move an agent that is not handling conversations to another queue, or they need to move it somewhere else. Supervisors now have the ability to work with Agentforce directly, which is a nice update. And then surveys, which is also called feedback management. That's the product that Salesforce packages surveys under, feedback management. Surveys can now capture partially completed forms, which is a really big update for surveys. Beforehand, it would have required you to finish a survey all the way before that data would get submitted. Now, that data can be recorded partially. So from a business perspective, if you're the one that is actually pushing those surveys out, it gives you more insight because you can see abandonment, you can see the information that was submitted before it was abandoned, things like that. But from a customer perspective, if you're the one completing the survey, let's say you get interrupted in the middle of it and you have to go do something else. Well, instead of having to come back to a brand new survey with none of the information filled out, you can come back to whatever you've already completed and just finish it out from there. So I'm very excited for that because that's been something that we've been asking for quite some time. And it adds quite a lot of power on both sides, right? To the business to be able to capture that information and report on it, but also what an added convenience if you're filling out that survey and you don't have to worry about it getting wiped out when you leave.
Yeah, that is actually quite exciting, to be fair. Some fantastic new releases then for Spring 25. Zack, well, look, that's a wrap for today's episode of the Fast Slow Motion podcast. Zack, thank you so much for walking us through the new release and sharing your insights.
Thanks for having me, Sam. Always a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you again for tuning in. And if you'd like to learn more about the Salesforce Spring 25 release, or if you need help implementing these features, you can visit us at fastslowmotion.com. Don't forget, as always, to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Check out past episodes at fastslowmotion.com/podcast. And you can send us your questions or your comments at fastslowmotion.com/podcast feedback.